September 17, 1944, Eastern France, where the Western Front was beginning to break. By the fall of 1944, the German army was cracking like old iron. Reports poured into Allied headquarters every hour, battalions dissolving overnight, officers fleeing, civilians hanging white sheets from shattered windows. In the Ardennes and across Alsace, entire divisions had begun to unravel, not from enemy fire but from starvation, exhaustion, and fear of their own commanders. The Reich was cannibalizing itself. It was the kind of collapse that history books would one day describe in neat, dry sentences. But out here, where the morning fog clung low over ruined villages and forests smoldered like dying giants, the collapse was raw, violent, and loud. Groaning timber, crashing artillery, and the distant, ragged screams of men whose world was ending. Lieutenant Jack Mercer heard all of it as he pushed through the gray dawn with his reconnaissance squad. Every sound seemed amplified. The sucking squelch of mud under boots, the metallic clack of rifles shifting against gear, the soft hiss of wind as it curled through charred branches above. The world around them felt half dead, as if the land itself had been stunned by too much suffering. A cold wind knifed between the trees, carrying faint, eerie echoes across the mist, whispers of war lingering in the broken timberline. "Eyes sharp," Jack murmured. His voice floated in the quiet like a low drumbeat. "Something's off." Private Ward nodded, jaw tight. "Feels like walking into a grave that hasn't decided who it belongs to." They moved deeper into the trees. The air smelled of wet ash and gunpowder, sharp, bitter, clinging. Somewhere overhead, a loose sheet of metal on a ruined barn clattered against itself, a hollow clang, 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 like a warning bell in an abandoned cathedral. Then another sound cut through the forest, soft, metallic, repeating in a slow, sickening rhythm. Clink, clink, clink. Jack raised his fist, and 7 soldiers froze at once. The sound was too steady to be debris, too deliberate to be nature. He motioned forward. Ward ghosted ahead of him, weaving between blackened tree stumps. The mist thinned just enough to reveal the outline of a wooden post standing alone in a clearing. Too straight, too clean, too purposeful. And something was tied to it. Jack's breath locked in his chest. He stepped closer, pushing aside a curtain of fog. A young woman, no older than 25, was bound tightly to the post, her head slumped forward, her arms twisted harshly behind her. Her Luftwaffe auxiliary uniform was torn at the shoulder, soaked from night rain, spattered with dried mud. A thin rope bit deep into the skin of her wrists. The wind caught a piece of cardboard on her chest, making it flap and clatter against the wood. Clink, clink, clink. Jack stared at the words scrawled across it in thick black paint. Verrater in Traitor Ward let out a low, involuntary curse. Good God. Jack took a slow step forward, the muddy ground sucking at his boots like something alive. The woman's face came into view, pale, streaked with grime, bruised along the jawline. Her lips were cracked. Blood had dried at the corner of her mouth in a dark, rust-colored smudge. She lifted her head with tremendous effort. Her eyes, an icy, exhausted blue, met his. For a heartbeat, neither of them spoke. Then she whispered, voice breaking like thin glass, "If you intend to kill me, please, do it quickly." Her German accent curled around every word. Hollow, defeated, stripped of hope long before she ever saw an American uniform. Jack felt the breath leave him. This wasn't the fear of a soldier facing an enemy. This was the resignation of someone already abandoned by her own side. Ward stepped up beside him. "Sir, the Germans did this to her, their own people." Jack didn't answer immediately. He took in the scene. The tight knots, the bruises, the dried tears on her cheeks, the cardboard sign that thumped against her chest with every unsteady breath. The Reich was collapsing so violently that it was turning its cruelty inward. Soldiers shot for retreating, civilians hanged for speaking of defeat, and now nurses executed for mercy. Jack felt a slow, deep anger rise, not hot and explosive, but cold, principled, carved from the same place that made American soldiers fight not just to win, but to remain human. He turned to his squad. "Cut her down." The order was simple, final, and it carried the quiet thunder of American values forged in dust storms, factory floors, and small-town kitchens. The values of a generation raised to believe that strength meant nothing without decency. Ward sliced the rope, and the woman collapsed forward. Jack lunged, catching her before her knees hit the ground. She tensed instantly, trembling with terror. "No one's going to hurt you," Jack whispered. "Not now. Not ever." She blinked, confused. She had been taught Americans were monsters, brutes, violators, torturers. But the arms holding her were steady, careful, human. Jack lifted his canteen. "Drink." He tipped it gently so a line of water touched her lips. She flinched, then froze. The realization hit her slowly. It was only water, cool, clean, pure. Her breath quivered. She took another sip, then another, desperate but afraid of her own desperation. Behind them, the squad watched silently. These were men from Indiana, Texas, Pennsylvania. Men whose fathers had taught them to help a neighbor before helping themselves. Men who fought a brutal war without surrendering the decency they'd been raised with. Ward exhaled softly. "Sir, this is why we're out here, isn't it?" Jack tightened his grip around the trembling woman. "Yes," he said quietly. "This is exactly why." And in that fog-drenched clearing, lit only by the fading glow of a dying dawn, the American squad stood a little taller, not because they were soldiers, but because they knew that even in the ugliest corners of war, they had chosen the better path. The sign on the post behind them creaked in the wind. "Traitor." But as Jack lifted the woman into his arms, it was clear to every man present who the real traitors were. Not her. Never her. For a long moment after Lieutenant Jack Mercer lifted her from the post, Liselle Hoffner could not understand what was happening. She felt the warmth of American hands, the softness of the blanket Ward wrapped around her shoulders, the clean water sliding down her throat like something stolen from a dream. Yet her mind clung to the last certainty she possessed, that death at the hands of the enemy would be swift and merciless. Kindness could not be real, not from Americans, not from the men she had been taught to fear since her first day in uniform. As Jack carried her through the thinning fog, she closed her eyes, half-conscious, drifting in and out like someone floating between two worlds. And in that drifting darkness, her mind snapped back to the life she had known before the post, before the ropes, before the bruises, and the story of how she ended up there began to unspool, thread by trembling thread. Liesl Hoffner had not been born with the hardness war demanded. She was 24, raised in a small village outside Stuttgart, a place of orchards, red-tiled roofs, and church bells that rang across fields in spring. Her father had been a schoolteacher, her mother a seamstress. They were not political people. They kept their heads down as the tides of Hitler's Germany rose around them, first quietly, then violently. By 1942, the war had swallowed everything. The village youth marched off in gray uniforms. The school closed. The orchard fields were stripped for rationing. Liesel volunteered for the medical corps not out of devotion to the Reich, but because she could not stand to remain passive while boys she had grown up with came home in wooden boxes. Her training was quick, brutal, efficient. She learned to suture under flickering lights in a converted gymnasium. She learned to carry wounded men twice her size. She learned to separate screams of pain from screams of dying, and she learned the most important lesson the instructors hammered into them every morning. Mercy is weakness. Weakness is treason. At first, she thought it was just rhetoric, something shouted by stern officers trying to hearten young women too gentle for the front. But as the war dragged into 1944 and Allied pressure crushed the German lines in France, the rule became something else, something darker. Mercy became forbidden. Kindness became dangerous. And loyalty, absolute, unquestioning loyalty, became a matter of life and death. Her unit had been stationed outside Nancy in the late summer of '44. The front was collapsing faster than their commanders could lie about it. Orders changed daily. Supplies ran low. Wounded poured into their makeshift tent hospital in waves, bleeding, burning, crying out for help. One of them was Corporal Felix Brandt, a 20-year-old radio operator whose convoy had been shelled on the retreat eastward. He had lost too much blood by the time they dragged him in. Skin gray, lips cracked, eyes glassy with fever. "Water," he whispered. "Please. Water." Liesel hesitated. She knew the regulation. Water was rationed. Only those deemed salvageable were allowed precious drops. The others waited for morphine or death, whichever came first. But Felix wasn't begging for luxury. He was begging for dignity. She knelt beside him, her hands shaking. "Just a sip," she whispered, "just enough to ease your throat." She lifted a cup to his lips, and that was when Sergeant Weber walked in. He froze, his eyes narrowed. A vein pulsed at his temple. "What?" he said slowly. "Are you doing?" Liesel stiffened, lowering the cup. "He asked for—" "I don't care what he asked for," Weber snapped. "Orders are clear. Water's for the living, not the dying. You waste the fatherland supplies on a corpse?" Felix wasn't a corpse yet, but arguing with Weber was suicide. He ripped the cup from her hand, flung the remaining droplets into the dirt, and grabbed her by the arm. "You sentimental little fool," he hissed. "This is treason, and treason must be punished." An hour later, Felix died. Quietly. Alone. And Liesel's punishment began. They dragged her from the medical tent after dusk when the wounded had been transferred and the remaining staff too exhausted to protest. She remembered the cold hands on her wrists, the boots kicking her knees out from under her, the blows that landed like thunder across her jaw, her ribs, her stomach. They tied her to the post at the forest's edge, pulling the ropes so tight her fingers went numb. They hung the cardboard sign around her neck. Verräterin. The final blow came from the officer in charge, a gaunt man with eyes like polished ice. "You gave aid to a dying man," he spat. "Aid to a deserter. Aid to weakness. Do you know what that makes you?" She tried to speak, but blood pooled in her mouth. "It makes you an enemy of the Reich," he said, "and enemies of the Reich do not deserve bullets." They left her there in the dark, tied to the post, the world spinning in and out of focus as pain surged through her limbs. She listened to the fading footsteps, the rustle of leaves, the distant rumble of artillery creeping closer from the west. Hours passed, maybe many hours, maybe days. She lost all sense of time. She only knew one thing with certainty. If the Americans found her, she would suffer far worse. She had grown up under the shadow of propaganda as thick as smoke. Posters in every public square showed Americans as twisted caricatures, wild-eyed, dark-skinned brutes armed with clubs and chains. School instructors called the United States a mongrel nation, a place where blood mixed into degeneracy. Women's auxiliaries were shown films warning them, if captured by Americans, you will be violated, you will be tortured, you will never leave alive. Every rumor reinforced the fear. German soldiers in retreat whispered that American troops carved stars into prisoners' foreheads, that they kept women as trophies, that they killed surrendering soldiers on the spot. Liesel believed all of it. Why wouldn't she? She had never known anything else. So when she heard American voices, deep, steady, English rolling through the trees like distant thunder, her heart seized. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the final blow. She had expected brutality, cruelty, mockery. What she received instead was an American lieutenant carefully untying the ropes, cradling her as if she were made of glass. Not a strike, not a threat, not a single raised voice. Just calm hands, steady breath, and water that tasted like mercy. She could not understand it, and that confusion was more terrifying than the beatings had been. What Liesel did not know, what she had no reason to know, was that the United States military had built its reputation on a code entirely foreign to her experience. The U.S. Army's regulations on prisoners of war were not guidelines. They were iron laws. General Eisenhower himself had repeatedly reminded his ranks, "We fight hard, but we do not fight with hate." It was a philosophy Americans carried like a second uniform. They were sons of the greatest generation, men raised during the Dust Bowl, the Great Depression, and the New Deal. Men taught to help neighbors, to feed the hungry, to protect the vulnerable. Men who believed that victory meant nothing if they abandoned decency along the way. To them, Liesel was not a traitor, not a disgrace, not a stain. She was a human being their enemy had nearly killed. Ward had said it best when they walked away from the post. "Sir, this is why we're out here, isn't it?" Jack had answered quietly, "Yes, and this is why we're going to win." When Liesel drifted back into consciousness in the American camp later that afternoon, the first thing she saw was a medic kneeling beside her cot. He was humming, softly, tunelessly, while preparing a fresh bandage. The tent smelled not of fear or disinfectant or the stench of unwashed bodies, but of coffee and soap. She blinked, confused. No one showed it at her. No one spat on her. No one kicked her. For a long moment she lay perfectly still, unable to move, unable to breathe, unable to process that someone was tending to her wounds without hatred humming behind his eyes. And somewhere in that tent, among the steady hands and gentle voices and warmth she had not felt in months, a strange and terrifying thought took root. A thought she tried desperately to resist. That maybe, just maybe, everything she had been taught about Americans was a lie. For the Americans who heard her story later, it would become one more thread in the vast tapestry of that era. Another reminder of who they had been, who their fathers and grandfathers had been. A generation defined not only by the war they fought, but by the values they refused to surrender. The kind of America people still speak of with a catch in their voice. The kind of America many fear has been lost. And as Liselle lay trembling beneath warm blankets, surrounded by the enemy who had shown her more humanity in one morning than her own army had in years, she began to understand something she had never imagined. That mercy, real mercy, had a face, and it wore an American uniform. For a few long seconds after the Americans carried her from the post, Liselle drifted at the edge of consciousness, caught somewhere between terror and disbelief. The echoes of her own memories, Sergeant Weber's voice, the blows, the accusation of treason, still reverberated through her skull. She had expected pain, humiliation, the cruelty she'd been promised since training camp. Yet, instead of brutality, she found herself held upright by steady hands, wrapped in a warmth she did not understand. And before she could fully grasp the shift, Jack Mercer's voice cut through the forest air with crisp authority. "Cut her down. Get her water. She's a prisoner of war. Treat her right." Liselle's eyes snapped open. Her lungs froze. This was not the command she had prepared for. It was the opposite. Utterly, incomprehensibly opposite. Private Thomas knelt behind her, reaching for the knots that still bit into her skin. His gloves brushed her shoulder. The contact was so gentle, so unexpected that her body reacted before her mind could intervene. She jerked violently away, a strangled cry ripping from her throat. "Don't touch me! Please, don't!" Her voice cracked on the last word, raw with memories. The Germans had touched her with fists, boots, rope. She had never been handled softly since the day she'd joined the Corps. The instinct to flinch was carved into her bones. Thomas froze, hands lifted defensively. "Easy," he murmured. "We're not here to hurt you." But Liselle didn't believe him. Couldn't believe him. She braced herself as he reached again, slowly this time, carefully, and slid a hand beneath her arm to steady her. She trembled uncontrollably, eyes squeezed shut, waiting for the blow that should have followed. But it didn't follow. Instead, she felt herself lowered gently to a patch of grass. A blanket, soft, woolen, smelling faintly of soap and campfire, was draped over her shoulders. Her breath caught as warmth seeped into her skin. Then she heard the footsteps, measured, confident. A shadow knelt beside her. When she opened her eyes, she saw an American medic setting his bag on the ground, not looming, over her, not barking orders, not wearing the sneer she associated with captors and interrogators. He knelt. He actually knelt. His voice was low, calm, almost apologetic. "Let's take a look at those wrists." Liselle tried to pull away, but her strength evaporated. She could only watch as he gently lifted her hands. The ropes had left deep, angry grooves around her skin. He ran his fingers along the wounds with surprising delicacy. His touch was feather-light, as though he feared hurting her further. "Whoever tied these knew exactly where to cut circulation," he said quietly to Jack. "She's lucky she can still move her fingers." Lucky. She almost laughed. Nothing about the last 24 hours felt like luck. The medic cleaned the wounds with warm water, the cloth gliding softly across her skin. Every stroke was a contradiction to everything she believed about Americans. When he finished with her wrists, he examined her bruised ribs, the welt on her jaw, the dried blood in her hair. With each careful motion, Liselle felt something inside her tighten and loosen all at once, like a knot fighting against its own unraveling. Someone handed her a canteen. "Here," a young voice said. She hesitated. Was it safe? Was this another trick? But when her trembling fingers brushed the metal, she felt no malice behind it, only offering. The water tasted impossibly clean, pure, cold, real. She swallowed greedily until the medic eased the canteen back. Slowly, you'll make yourself sick. A strange heat bloomed in her chest, not shame, but something gentler, unfamiliar, disarming. Then came the words that struck deepest of all. A young soldier, barely older than Felix had been, crouched in front of her. His helmet was too big for him, slightly lopsided, and dust clung to his boots. His expression held no triumph, no disgust, no suspicion, just earnest sincerity. "We don't hurt nurses," he said softly. "We save people, even if they wear gray." Lyselle stared at him, stunned. It wasn't the sentence itself that shattered her. It was the way he said it. Quiet, matter-of-fact, like a truth so simple it needed no explanation. Her breath stuttered. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. Americans weren't supposed to act this way. But they did. Thomas adjusted the blanket on her shoulders. The medic continued bandaging her wrist. Jack stood above her with the steady presence of someone who carried duty like a moral compass. Every one of them moved with a care she had not felt from her own country in years. The contrast was so sharp it hurt. More than the bruises, more than the rope, more than the cold night against the post. For the first time since the war began, Lyselle was not ordered, not struck, not shamed, not threatened. She was tended to. She sat utterly still, afraid that if she moved, if she breathed too deeply, the fragile moment would shatter and reveal itself as illusion. But it didn't shatter. The Americans kept working around her with quiet, steady resolve. Men who had crossed an ocean to fight a war but still carried in their hands the gentleness of farm boys, steelworkers, mechanics, and sons, raised to believe in decency. She felt the warmth of the blanket. She tasted the water lingering on her tongue. She saw the unguarded compassion in the medic's eyes. And something inside her, some old, deeply buried certainty, began to fracture. The fear she had been taught for years tried to rise, but it couldn't stand against what she was seeing with her own eyes. Kindness. Real kindness. The kind she had almost forgotten existed. Lyselle's lips trembled. Her fingers curled around the blanket as though it were the last solid thing in the world. The fear didn't disappear. It didn't fade, but it faltered. And, in its hesitation, a new emotion slipped through, a fragile, trembling disbelief. She had been warned that Americans were monsters. But the only monsters that morning had been the men who tied her to the post, the ones wearing her uniform. Not theirs. The ride from the clearing to the temporary American aid station passed in a blur of shifting light and muffled sound. Lyselle drifted in and out of awareness, feeling the jolt of the jeep beneath her, the occasional brush of a blanket pulled tighter around her shoulders, the low murmur of English voices she still feared but no longer understood in the same way. Something inside her was changing, not enough to feel safe, but enough to feel confused, painfully, dangerously confused. When the jeep finally stopped, Jack Mercer lifted her down as if she weighed nothing at all. The tent that awaited her was simple canvas, its flaps fluttering in the breeze, but inside it glowed with a gentle light. Lanterns hung at regular intervals, illuminating a row of cots, a table of medical supplies, and a pot of steam rising from a portable stove. It smelled of soap, broth, and clean cotton. Nothing about it resembled the German field station she knew, where fear, shortages, and exhaustion hung heavier than the canvas itself. Jack guided her to a cot. His voice was low, steady, almost too soft for her to hear. "Sit. Rest now." She hesitated, not because she didn't want to sit, but because she didn't know if she was allowed to. In the Reich, she had learned quickly that even the smallest act, sitting without permission, drinking at the wrong time, tending to the wrong soldier, could cost her everything. But Jack nodded encouragingly, so she lowered herself onto the cot, trembling. A medic approached, but did not speak immediately. He adjusted her blanket, checked her pulse, then disappeared for a moment. When he returned, he carried a metal bowl, cupped carefully in both hands. Steam curled upward like delicate threads. Soup. Real soup. He set it on the small stand beside her and stepped back. Lyselle stared at the bowl as though it might disappear if she blinked. "It's for you," Jack told her. She never reached for food first. German officers taught them, soldiers first, civilians second, women last. But as the steam brushed her face, something inside her cracked. Her vision blurred. Her hands rose halfway, then stopped. She lowered them again. Jack saw it. He picked up the bowl, held it in both hands, and placed it gently into her palms. "Go on," he said softly. "Eat." And just like that, without warning, without preparation, without any defense left, Liselle burst into tears. Her sobs came in sudden, violent waves, racking her thin body as though her ribs might give way beneath the weight of them. She tried to speak, but the words tangled in her throat, choked by days of fear and hunger and the humiliation of being left tied to die. Jack waited. He didn't touch her, didn't rush her, didn't ask what was wrong. He simply sat on the edge of the next cot, elbows on his knees, eyes lowered, giving her a privacy few prisoners were ever granted. It took minutes, long, aching minutes, before her breathing eased enough for words to form. When they finally came, they came in fragments. "He was dying," she whispered. Jack looked up. The German soldier. He begged for water. Her voice cracked again. "I gave him some." She swallowed hard, the memory pulling her downward like a stone dropped into deep water. "They saw," she said, "and they called it betrayal." Jack's jaw tightened, but he didn't speak. She continued, the words spilling out with a trembling earnestness that came from truth forced too long into silence. "They beat me," she whispered. "They said mercy was treason. They said I helped a coward. They said I was worse than the enemy." Her fingers clenched around the bowl, but she didn't drink. Not yet. Jack leaned forward, his voice quiet enough that no one else in the tent could hear. "Where I come from," he said, "helping a dying man makes you human, not a traitor." The simplicity of it struck her harder than any blow. Her eyes lifted to his face, searching for mockery, for judgment, for some hidden cruelty. She found none. The medic returned, checking her bandages again. He offered her a spoon. She lifted the bowl with shaking hands, sipped the broth, and closed her eyes as warmth spread through her chest like something holy. She did not remember the last time she'd eaten without fear, and for several minutes there was only the sound of her spoon scraping softly against metal. She didn't know it then, but this moment, this bowl of soup, this quiet compassion, would stay with her longer than any wound. Hours later, after her injuries were stabilized and her strength returned enough to sit upright, the Americans prepared to transfer her to a permanent POW camp. The jeep ride was smoother, cleaner, less chaotic than the night she'd been taken by her own comrades. But fear returned as soon as she saw the barbed wire rising in the distance. She had been in German camps. She knew what cages felt like. She braced for shouting, for dogs, for humiliation. The jeep rolled to a stop. A guard opened the door and extended a hand. "Ma'am, watch your step." "Ma'am." The word was so gentle, so impossibly polite that Liselle hesitated. No German officer had ever called her anything but girl, auxiliary, or worse when they were angry. She stepped down. The ground beneath her boots was clean gravel, not mud. The guards' uniforms were neat. The gate was open, not forced, not ominous, but opened carefully for her to pass through. Inside, the camp resembled a quiet village more than a prison. She was handed a small bundle, a clean uniform, soap, and a folded wool blanket. The guard who passed it to her nodded politely. "These are yours." Hers. She didn't know what to do with the word. A doctor examined her next. He was older, with silver hair and a calm voice. His stethoscope was cold against her back, and she flinched instantly, instinctively. He paused. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "I'll warm it." He rubbed the metal piece gently between his palms before placing it again on her skin. The gesture, so small, so thoughtful, broke her open. She covered her face and wept. Not because it hurt, but because she could not understand why an enemy was treating her with a kindness she had never known from her own commanding officers. The doctor waited, respectfully silent, until her sobs diminished. "You're safe here," he said. "No one will harm you. Not while you wear our care." His words felt unreal. They contradicted everything she had been taught, everything she had lived, everything that had almost killed her. When the exam ended, a young guard appeared with a tin cup. "Coffee," he offered. "Coffee." She took it with both hands, lifting it as though it were sacred. The warmth seeped into her fingers, and the scent, rich, deep, unfamiliar, surrounded her like a blanket. She sipped, and then she stared at the dark, swirling liquid, feeling something inside her begin to unravel. A letter-writing desk stood by the wall. A Red Cross clerk gestured to it. "You may write home," he said. "Write home." Her vision blurred again, not from pain, not from exhaustion, but from a dawning realization so profound she could barely breathe through it. She was a prisoner, a captured enemy, a uniformed participant in a brutal war. And yet, she had been given warmth, given care, given dignity, given her name back. Not one American had struck her. Not one had cursed her. Not one had mocked her. Instead, they had fed her, clothed her, treated her wounds, called her ma'am. And in a moment that would stay with her for the rest of her life, someone had even warmed a cold instrument before touching her skin. As she sat with a cup of coffee warming her palms, a single question rose to the surface. Sharp, agonizing, undeniable. Why did the enemy see her as human, when her own army had left her tied to a post like an animal? It was a question that would haunt her, reshape her, and change every truth she thought she knew. And as she looked around that quiet American camp, listening to distant laughter from guards who had just finished their shift, watching the Red Cross clerk prepare envelopes for prisoners who would write to loved ones, she felt a trembling recognition forming in the deepest chamber of her heart. Everything she feared about Americans, everything she'd been taught, everything the Reich had drilled into her had been a lie. And the truth, gentle, overwhelming, impossible, was finally breaking through. The harder Liesel tried to steady herself, the more the world tilted beneath her. Humanity had broken through once in that steaming bowl of soup Jack placed gently into her hands. But what waited beyond that moment would break her in an entirely different way. For as the jeep rolled toward the American POW camp, her brief flicker of hope evaporated. The closer they came to the fences rising ahead, tall, silver, crowned with barbs, the more her fear returned, raw and instinctive. Mercy in the forest had been one thing, a temporary kindness, perhaps a strategy, perhaps a trick of circumstance. But a prison was another matter entirely. She'd seen German camps. She knew what cages could do to people. She braced herself, shoulders tightening under the thin blanket, preparing for the cruelty she had been trained to expect. Yet the moment her boots touched the ground, reality unraveled again. A guard stepped forward, not shouting, not pointing a rifle, but opening the jeep door and extending a hand to her. "Ma'am, watch your step." "Ma'am." The word struck her like a blow, not for its harshness but for its gentleness, its absurd, inexplicable respect. No German officer had ever called her anything but Fräulein, auxiliary, or, in darker moments, far worse. She hesitated, confused, and the guard steadied her elbow lightly. Easy now. Inside the camp she expected shouting, inspections, the barked orders of men in foul moods. Instead, she saw order, clean gravel paths, neatly built barracks, a Red Cross flag fluttering beside the American one. And everywhere the quiet hum of something she had not known in months. Routine, discipline, calm. A corporal handed her a bundle. "These are for you." She stared at it blankly. Inside lay a clean uniform, a bar of soap, a small towel, and a folded wool blanket that smelled faintly of cedar. "For me," she whispered. He nodded. "Standard issue." She swallowed hard. The Reich had taught her that American prisoners were beaten, starved, degraded. But here she stood being issued items she hadn't had since the war began. Then another voice. "This way, miss." "Miss." The words continued to feel foreign, misplaced, like a costume too fine for someone in her tattered condition. They led her to the infirmary. A doctor with silver hair, spectacles perched low on his nose, looked up as she entered. His eyes widened, not with suspicion, but with concern. "My God," he murmured. "What did they do to you?" She tried to answer, but he shook his head gently. "No need to speak yet. Sit. You're safe." Safe. The word held no meaning anymore. Not yet. A nurse approached, young, brisk, with auburn hair pulled into a tight bun. She carried a stethoscope, its metal end gleaming under the lamplight. "Let's get you examined." Liesel forced herself not to recoil. She had been examined before, roughly, coldly, as though her body were an object, not her own. But this nurse paused, noticing her flinch. "It's cold," she said softly. "I'll warm it first." And then, in an act so small it should have meant nothing but somehow meant everything, she rubbed the stethoscope between her palms until the metal lost its chill. Only then did she touch it to Liesel's back. That was the moment Liesel broke. Her breath caught, turned sharp, then shattered. A sob tore up from a place so deep she hadn't realized it was there, and suddenly she was weeping. Violent, uncontrollable, shaking so hard the nurse had to steady her shoulders to keep her upright. The doctor stepped back, giving her space. The nurse murmured soothing sounds. Someone pressed a cloth into her hand to dry her face. But nothing could stop the collapse. She wasn't crying from pain. She wasn't crying from fear. She was crying because she finally understood. For months, she had been nothing but a tool to the Reich. Useful when obedient, disposable when she showed the slightest hint of compassion. She had been beaten for mercy, bound for kindness, left to die for humanity. But here, in the camp of her enemy, men and women she had been told were monsters saw her as human the moment she crossed their threshold. Why? Why? The question clawed at her chest until the sobs choked into silence. The doctor waited, then spoke gently. You are not the first German we've treated like this, and you won't be the last. Not the first, not the last. She looked up slowly, eyes blurred. Why do you help us? She whispered. Why, me? He studied her for a long moment, then took off his glasses and folded them in his hands. Because you are a patient, he said. Because you're wounded. Because war doesn't give us the right to stop being human. Her throat tightened. She looked away, unable to hold the weight of his words. The nurse placed a warm cup of something dark and fragrant on the table beside her. Coffee, she said. Drink. It will help. Liesel lifted the cup with trembling hands. The warmth seeped into her palms like a memory from another life. She took a small sip. The flavor washed over her tongue. Rich, bitter, warm. She had not tasted anything like it since. Her training days before the world became fire and hunger. Her tears returned, slower this time, quieter but no less painful. Do Americans? She swallowed, voice breaking. Do you treat all prisoners like this? The doctor nodded. We follow the Geneva Convention. It's our duty. Her brow knit, need to stand at attention here. Liesel blinked, caught off guard. Her body forgot how to relax. Her arms twitched at her sides as if unsure what to do with the sudden freedom. Jack glanced at the bandages she'd been organizing. Looks like you're settling in. She nodded once, then again, unsure if she was allowed to speak freely. Jack noticed the hesitation and softened his voice. I came to check on you before we ship out, he said. My unit moves at dawn. The words struck her harder than she expected. Something inside her tightened. Not fear, not dependence, but something more fragile, something she had almost forgotten how to feel. She looked at him for a long moment, searching his face for the cruelty she'd been taught to expect, for the condescension German officers had always carried, for the cold detachment of men who believed rank gave them the right to judge. But she found none of it, only sincerity, and something gentle beneath it. Her voice trembled when it finally emerged. Why were you kind to me? Even when my own army wasn't. Jack paused. The question hovered between them like a delicate thing, fragile enough to break with the wrong answer. He took a slow breath, eyes drifting briefly, toward the horizon where the sun was melting into the tree line. When he looked back at her, his expression had changed, calmer, deeper, touched by something that came from a place older than the war. War tells us to hate, he said quietly, but hate is easy. He stepped closer, not invading her space, but offering truth the way he had offered water. Decency. That's the hard part, and someone has to choose the harder thing. Liesel felt her breath catch. She lowered her eyes, not to hide tears, but to steady herself against the weight of what he had said. Decency. The word felt foreign on her tongue, yet familiar to her soul. She thought of Felix Brandt begging for water. She thought of the German officers who beat her for giving it. She thought of the Americans who had warmed a stethoscope before touching her skin. War tells us to hate, but hate is easy. Her voice was barely above a whisper. I don't understand how you could, she swallowed, how you could see me as worth saving. Jack's reply was soft. Because you are. Simple, unadorned, unquestioned. Lisel closed her eyes and her shoulders sagged, not in fear, not in submission, but in surrender to a truth she had fought too long to deny. For the first time since the war began, she felt safe. Truly, completely safe. Not because she was guarded, not because she was fed, not because she had a bed or a blanket or a cup of warm coffee, but because someone, an enemy, a stranger, a soldier in a different uniform, had seen her humanity when even her own nation had refused to. When she looked up again, something in her expression had changed, softened, opened. Jack noticed it, and for a moment the war around them felt very far away. He gave a small nod, shouldered his pack, and stepped back. "Take care of yourself, Liesel." Her name in his voice felt like another gift. As he walked away, the last of the evening sun caught on his uniform, casting him in amber light. Liesel watched until he disappeared behind the barracks and the shadows swallowed him. Only then did she let the tears fall. Not from sorrow, but from an overwhelming, humbling understanding. Kindness from an enemy had saved her life. But decency had saved something even deeper. And she knew, with a certainty so sharp it cut through every lie she had ever been fed, that this moment, this awakening, would shape the rest of her days. In the quiet after Jack's departure, something fragile opened inside Liesel Hoffner, something she could not yet name. The war, with all its machinery and madness, would grind on for many more months. But for Liesel, a battle far more intimate had already reached its turning point. What she witnessed in the... But the war... War, he said firmly, is not an excuse to forget what is right. She tried to absorb the words, but they pressed against every wall she had built inside herself, every belief she had been taught, every lie she had swallowed without question. Outside, through the infirmary window, the camp moved with quiet purpose. Guards spoke respectfully. Prisoners carried buckets, wrote letters, walked freely within the boundaries. There were no screams, no beatings, no dogs, no boots slamming into ribs, none of the cruelties she had witnessed within her own ranks. She looked back at the doctor and nurse. Their patience, their warmth, their utter lack of hatred had torn something open inside her that she didn't yet know how to mend. "Why?" she whispered again. "Why treat me like this, when my own army, when they tied me like a dog, when they beat me like an animal, when they called me a traitor for refusing to watch a boy die?" The nurse seemed to read the unfinished sentence in her eyes. She placed a hand lightly over Liesel's, not gripping it, not claiming it, just resting there, steady and human. "You're not in their hands anymore," she said softly. "You're in ours." Liesel's breath faltered. Her fingers curled under the nurse's palm, not in fear but in desperate, bewildered gratitude. All at once she felt the weight of every lie the Reich had fed her, every warning about American savagery, every poster, every lesson, every shouted order about how the enemy would treat her. They had been wrong, horribly, monstrously wrong. Because the enemy who held her now did not hurt her, did not shame her, did not degrade her. They warmed cold metal so it wouldn't sting her skin. She covered her face with both hands and let out a long, shaking breath, no longer fighting the collapse. She let it sweep through her, hollow her out, transform her. The truth had broken through, so bright it nearly blinded her. Why did the enemy treat her like a person when her own soldiers had left her to die like an animal? It was the question she would carry for the rest of her life. And as she sat in that quiet American infirmary, wrapped in a wool blanket, coffee warming her hands, bandages clean against her skin, surrounded by people who owed her nothing, yet gave her everything, Liesel Hoffner understood, with a clarity sharp enough to cut. Her enemy had saved more than her life. They had saved her humanity. In the days that followed, Liesel moved through the American camp in a quiet haze, as if each hour held something that forced her to relearn the world. The emotional collapse she had endured in the infirmary did not simply fade. It reshaped her. Every small kindness from the Americans seemed to press gently but relentlessly on the question she could no longer outrun. Why did they treat her like this? Why had they seen her humanity when her own people had refused to? She carried those questions like a weight as she learned the rhythms of the camp. She slept on a real bed for the first time in months. A thin mattress, yes, but soft, dry, and unmarked by fear. She stood in line for meals where no one shoved her, no one shouted insults, no one demanded she defend her loyalty. She watched guards tip their caps to older POWs, saw medics help limping prisoners over puddles, heard two American cooks arguing about whether German bread tasted better before the war. Every interaction chipped at something inside her. Every gesture unraveled another knot. And slowly, painfully, Lisa realized she was breathing without fear. The thought frightened her more than anything. One afternoon, not long before sunset, a familiar figure appeared at the camp gate. Lieutenant Jack Mercer, pack slung over his shoulder, uniform dusty from the march, stepped through the entrance with two other soldiers. They spoke briefly with the camp sergeant. Then Jack turned and made his way toward the infirmary where Liselle was sorting freshly washed bandages. For a heartbeat, she froze. She hadn't expected to see him again. She stood upright immediately, heels clicking together, back straight, posture rigid from years of drilled obedience. Her nerves bristled with the instinctive discipline Germany had carved into her. Jack paused when he reached her. A soft smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "You don't American camp." Fairness, dignity, and a steady, unadorned decency became the compass by which she would measure the world for the rest of her life. Germany welcomed her home not with warmth, but with ruin. Cities smoldered like open graves. Villages stood silent, emptied of joy. A nation that once demanded absolute faith now asked only for absolution. And in that shattered landscape, Liselle carried a truth few wished to hear, that mercy had come not from comrades, but from men once painted as monsters. Years passed. Children were born. Walls rose across her homeland, physical and invisible, and yet, deep in the quiet corners of her memory, she held on to that morning in the forest, the bowl of soup, the warmth of a stethoscope, and the American lieutenant who offered kindness where she expected cruelty. When the world finally softened enough for old wounds to breathe, she began telling the story, carefully, gently, like handling something both precious and painful. And Americans who heard stories like hers felt a stirring they could not quite name. A reminder of a time when their fathers and grandfathers believed that strength meant nothing if it abandoned decency. A reminder of a country striving, imperfectly, to live up to its own ideals. In the twilight of her life, Liselle walked slowly among the white crosses of an Allied cemetery. She placed wildflowers at a memorial stone and whispered a truth she had carried across continents and decades. He saved more than my life. He saved the part of me that still believed in goodness. Fade to black.